Welcome back to another episode of Gimme Some Truth. Today we are talking about a topic that's really, really important to expat people that maybe they don't think is that important, but it can really affect their lives as they move abroad, and that's what brokerage to use for your investments. This podcast is really just a snippet, if you will, of the long-form blog that Stan wrote. Did a great job writing it and got into detail that you should definitely look at. So this is just going to tease that blog post and give you some information. But we strongly encourage you to look at that for more detail. So, Stan, to get started here, why does this topic matter? What is it that makes it so important?
I mean, it matters to expats that we communicate with more than any other topic, for sure, right? Yep. Simply because most people, when they move abroad, they have their own existing advisory relationships, or they have their own retail solutions, yep. Right? And for the vast majority of them, it doesn't work anymore, right? I mean, simply put, and I'm surprised, 11 years into this, it doesn't seem to ever go away, this problem. People are still getting kicked out of their existing relationships, or, they're just coming to the conclusion that, advisors, working with these people, slowly but surely, unfortunately, slowly but surely come to the conclusion that they're out over their skis, and that their clients are facing tax and regulatory issues that are beyond their domestic experience. Of
the new people that you talk to, Stan, how many are surprised that this is an issue that they will face?
I think a lot of them are, but I also feel that expats generally feel a little persecuted.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
So you've got the FATCA rules make it very difficult for them to have foreign financial accounts, because a lot of banks, they're required, if they take on U.S. Citizens or suspected U.S. persons, they're required then to provide full financial data on those accounts directly to Treasury,
sure,
in the United States, or they face this punitive interbank withholding rules that would be financially ruinous for most banks, since the U.S. continues to kind of be, the reference currency, and it would just, it's a heavy stick the U.S. swings.
Sure.
But that's not what we're talking about per se, right? But then they'll also find that, for a multitude of different reasons that I detail more in the blog, most U.S. brokerages won't want to work with you if they know that you're living outside of the United States, which I think, frankly forces or encourages a lot of people to be less than forthcoming about their change of residence.
Yeah. Clint, maybe a rhetorical question, but there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, correct? I mean, as far as how we see the world, that doesn't exist, at least today.
I wish that there was a one-size-fits-all solution where we could just say XYZ brokerage works with, it's a global brokerage and works in every single country, but that's just not the case.
Yeah.
There's a lot of nuance to it too, because countries that you would think that would be totally fine, you look at the list from a custodian and they'll be like, nope, we don't do that one. And you say, seriously, they can't do Italy? And then you'll find out some arcane reason why they can't. So it's very interesting when you see that. And so just because you're moving to a European country doesn't mean that all of a sudden a big global brokerage is going to be able to take that account. And we work with this frequently. So sometimes you have to be creative or consider alternative custodians to be able to consider that. And I'll go back to Stan's thing, which I think is really important. Just putting on a P.O. box or kind of a fake mailing address, or doing your sister's address, is not a solution in our view. I think it's, first of all, it's underhanded, but not only that, you could face some tax repercussions and some difficulties as you go along. So just by doing that, I've heard that in our industry even, and it makes me kind of sick when I hear it. Oh yeah, just put your sister's address on on that brokerage statement, you're and your brokerage house, it'll be fine. And that's absolutely not the case.
Yeah, I think I don't think it's going too far to say that from a financial standpoint, it's dangerous to do that.
Well,
You've exposed yourself to a lot of liability at that point.
I mean, this is kind of timely because like you learn something new every day. And Sil and I were recently on a call, an kind of introductory getting to know you call with a tax attorney in France who brought up this point. He was looking for solutions for clients. And he said, people were using relatives' addresses. And when the tax authority finds that out, or should they find that out, they might get creative on you, right? As in, believe it or not, starting to say, well, if you moved your brokerage into, this place where you don't live, it's your sister's address, we may find that to be a taxable gift, which would be bonkers, right? But why risk that kind of friction, right? You're living in a new country. Let's not, complicate things more than language and culture. Let's not throw legal, friction into the equation, especially if you can avoid it.
What are some of the other constraints, Stan, in regard to, somebody's going to move to, a country outside the U.S. in the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months? I mean, what are some of the constraints that they should be considering in regard to how their assets sit today?
Right. Well, I mean, so it's a good question, and I like the way you framed it, because if you have some time before you move, I don't want to make this sound like a commercial, but reaching out to us to discuss, investment solutions, I will say that the choices are always better, or at least in many cases better, if you're making an intelligent choice, knowing the lay of the land, or talking to somebody that knows the lay of the land ahead of the move.
Yeah, and I think that this is an area where assumptions you have to be careful with, in almost every situation, but this is one where you better really be careful with an assumption. To Clint's point, I'm with a global brokerage firm. Clearly, they'll be able to help me wherever I'm moving.
Yeah.
You be very careful with those assumptions. Is that not correct?
I mean, that's very correct. And so there is, oftentimes we experience this, right? If a client or a prospective client reaches out to us because they're going to move to a certain country, then we have a solution that is available to open accounts while they're a U.S. person, and they're not going to get kicked out of the institutional, account, right? Meaning institutional, meaning that it's being managed by us, by a U.S. independent advisor, right? They're not going to get kicked out when they change their address to that country. But if somebody else calls me from the same country and they've been living there and they've been living there already, well, then I can't open an account for people in that same country with that solution. So we have to come up with an alternative solution. And an alternative solution means an institutional only brokerage that is, pretty much open to us. The relationship is directly with us, and they're pretty much open to servicing Americans so long as they don't live in an OFAC sanctioned country. Or there might be, a couple of countries where they can't do it, but pretty much the universe is much broader for an institutional only relationship that we have.
Yeah. That's right. It's a lot friendlier towards kind of that professional advisor relationship versus what we call like a retail relationship, which is like me just going on, as a general U.S. citizen opening a Robinhood account. That'd be just a retail account, but a financial advisor kind of sponsored account is held in a greater regard when it comes to these sorts of accounts. Just easier to get stuff done.
I mean, we'll use Europe as an example again as to why, this might be the case, as to why, it sounds very self-serving to say, well, I mean, the universe is broader and your choices are better if you're working with an advisor. But when you think about it, we have a lot of rules in the U.S. that, certain investment options are available to sophisticated investors. right? We have those rules, qualified purchaser type situation, right? And we feel like we can relax those rules. Well, Europe has, their own rules. And yes, they try to protect the little guy. So there are rules that limit non-EU registered products for people that live in those countries. But if they're working with an advisor overseas, those rules don't apply. And again, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but just understand, that there's method to this madness. There's reasons why certain brokerages that don't have a retail business have less regulatory pushback for servicing residents of those countries, because the direct relationship and the trading discretion and so on is left in the hands of the advisory firm that has a direct relationship with that institution.
Glenn, let's end with this. We've used the phrase "kicked out" quite a bit, and I think that's a really important thing to unpack just a little bit for people to understand. There's been a shift in the last, call it 5 to 10 years in this space of brokerage firms more or less saying to their existing clients, "You've moved to X country or X country in general. We're no longer, quote, servicing that country." Can you just unpack that a little bit for people so that they better understand what that means? Because I think that's a shock for a lot of people when they all of a sudden get a notice that says, more or less, "You're not welcome here anymore." I mean, that's pretty unnerving when somebody just moved and they get that notice.
Yeah, we've seen it a couple different ways. I mean, one way we saw it was just a brokerage house just being like, "No, we're done." And they basically sent a letter to all their clients and they're like, "You have X amount of time to move it out."
Yep.
We've seen that. And then we've seen other things where somebody might change their address and it might not even cause a problem for a little bit of time.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden they get that letter. And so it kind of
they might put a restriction that just freezes your ability to make purchases, right?
Right. Yeah. Liquidating accounts only, liquidating events only. And then you're kind of stuck, or yeah. And so we've seen this numerous times as well. And so you've got to, it's nice to know that, in most cases when you're working with an advisor that you're not going to get, kicked out if you're working with the right place. But even broker dealers in the United States that you think they're going to be okay with it, and you're with a large firm, and all of a sudden you find out too that they don't have any appetite to do that once. And a lot of times that is triggered on an address change or something like that, where they notice this foreign accounts out there and they're like, "Well, we can't have this account anymore." And they don't care how big the account is in that regard. The big brokerage houses, if your account's big enough, they usually kind of make an exception for some reason. Right. But for most people, the general millionaire next doors like we service, it can be very problematic. And then it's very stressful. You don't want your accounts being liquidated and things like that. So you want to make sure you're on top of things.
Yeah, I think ultimately, knowledge is power. And I think that knowledge is power, and being proactive is the solution in a lot of cases, as Stan alluded to, is gaining this information before you move. And even if you've already moved and you're in that spot, we can still help. But the more proactive you can be to reach out and ask questions and just understand what your specific situation looks like is going to make your life much, much easier. If you're moving abroad, you have plenty of things going on, from just getting your stuff abroad to, finding the right place to live. There's so many things that happen to people that move abroad. This is the last thing that you want to kind of catch you off guard and be one of those things that just, really occupies you for months on end trying to get it figured out. So we greatly encourage you to look at Stan's blog post. We think it's very, very well done and gives a lot of the information that people ask us for on a daily basis. So thanks again for tuning in to Gimme Some Truth, and we'll talk to you soon.
Walker Conn Financial Advisors is a registered investment advisor with the SEC. Registration with the SEC does not imply a certain level of skill or training. The opinions expressed by the participants of this podcast are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Walker Conn Financial Advisors. All statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. Information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. Thanks for listening, and for further information, please visit wachnercondon.com.